The quarterly review meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning on a Wednesday in March, and I arrived 12 minutes early because that is what I do when I am about to walk into something I cannot afford to lose. I had driven 4 hours from Portland the night before. I stayed at a courtyard off the highway rather than at my aunt's house, which was where my mother had assumed I would stay and had apparently already told people I would be staying. I did not want to give anyone the impression that I had come home. I had not come home. I had come to a meeting. The conference room on the 3rd floor of Hargrove Family Holdings occupied the corner of a building my grandfather had built in 1987 in Millhaven, Oregon, a town of roughly 11,000 people that had exactly one stoplight, one decent diner, and one family business that had employed half the town at various points over the past 4 decades. The room had a long oak table, 8 chairs, a whiteboard with dry erase markers someone had forgotten to recap, and a window that looked out over the parking lot, and beyond it, the water tower with Millhaven painted in faded letters on the side. My grandfather's name was Russell. He had died 11 weeks before that meeting, quietly, in his sleep, at 81, in the same house where my mother had grown up, and where I had spent every summer until I was 16. His attorney had contacted me in January to let me know that the trust contained specific provisions for me. I had asked what kind of provisions. He told me to come to the meeting. My mother and I had not spoken in close to 4 years. The last real conversation we'd had ended with her telling me I had always been too proud for my own good, that I had embarrassed this family by choosing to leave, and that if I thought I could just walk back in whenever it was convenient for me, I had another thing coming. I had not argued. I packed my car and drove north, and did not look in the rearview mirror until the Millhaven city limits sign had disappeared. She had not been entirely wrong about some of it. I had left quickly. I had not explained myself well, but the version of me she had decided I was had stopped being accurate a long time before I left, and I had run out of ways to correct it. My cousin met me in the parking lot before I went in. His name is Ash, short for Ashton, and he is 2 years younger than me and has always been the kind of person who tells you something difficult. Like he is apologizing for the weather, he said my mother had been talking. He said she had told most of the family I had only come back because of the money. He said my uncle, her brother, not my grandfather's son, had agreed with her loudly at dinner 2 nights before. I thanked him for telling me. I went inside. The conference room held 11 people by the time the meeting started. My grandfather's attorney, a man named Douglas Farrell, sat at the head of the table with a folder and a yellow legal pad. My mother sat to his left with her hands folded on the table, and beside her sat my uncle, whose name is Craig, and who has the particular energy of a man who has spent his whole life being the loudest person in whatever room he is in. There were other relatives, second cousins, a great-aunt, my mother's neighbor who had apparently been given a small bequest and was there to receive it, and there was a woman I did not recognize sitting 2 seats down from Farrell, which I noted and filed away. I sat at the far end of the table, set my bag on the floor, and placed my folder in front of me. My mother looked at me the way she always looks at me when she has decided something already and is simply waiting for events to confirm it. Not hostile exactly, more like someone watching a clock. Farrell opened the meeting. He explained the structure of the trust, the distribution of the business assets, the provisions for the family home. Most of it was expected. My grandfather had been deliberate and organized in everything he did, and his estate reflected that. There were no surprises in the first 40 minutes. Then Farrell said my name. He said that Russell had set aside a 31% stake in Hargrove Family Holdings in a separate provision, directed solely to me. The room did not go quiet so much as it changed temperature. My Uncle Craig leaned forward. My mother's hands came apart on the table. The great-aunt made a small sound that could have been anything. Farrell continued reading. The provision stated that this stake was to be awarded in recognition of my grandfather's confidence in my professional judgment and my demonstrated commitment to the values he had built the company around. He had added, in his own handwriting, a note that Farrell read aloud. She always asked the right questions. That matters more than people think. Craig recovered first. He said that this was a significant asset being handed to someone who had not been part of this business. He said I had been gone for 4 years. He said, and I remember the exact phrasing because I have thought about it many times since, that I had always been the one who thought she was too good for Millhaven, and that it was frankly insulting that Russell had rewarded that kind of selfishness. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at Farrell, because he understood that Farrell was the one with the legal pad. My mother nodded beside him, and then she did look at me, and she said in a voice that had gone flat and certain that I had spent the last 4 years building a life somewhere else, that I had missed holidays and birthdays and my grandfather's last 2 Christmases, and that whatever Russell might have believed about me, she knew what I had actually done with my time, which was to leave this family behind the moment things got hard. She said it plainly, the way she always says things she has rehearsed. Then she said she was not trying to be unkind, but that it would not be fair to the people who had stayed, who had shown up, who had actually done the work, for someone like me to walk in and receive the largest single stake in a company she had never invested in. The room was very still after that. The dry erase markers on the whiteboard had a brand name on them. I remember reading just to have somewhere to look. Farrell did not respond immediately. He looked down at his folder. Then he looked at the woman 2 seats down from him, the one I had noted earlier, and he said, "Westbrook, I think we can share the supplementary documentation now." The woman, whose name I learned then was Mara Westbrook, opened a leather portfolio and slid copies of a document to each seat at the table. I did not need to look at mine. I had helped write parts of it. What the room was reading was an 18-month operational assessment of Hargrove Family Holdings, conducted by an independent advisory firm called Westbrook Consulting, commissioned quietly by my grandfather in the year before his death. The assessment covered financial performance, staffing structure, long-term sustainability, and strategic risk. It was thorough. It was not flattering in several places. And on the first page, listed as the lead analyst on the engagement, was my name. My grandfather had hired me, not as his granddaughter, as a consultant. He had reached out through a mutual professional contact 18 months before the meeting, asking if I would be willing to take on a confidential engagement for a mid-size family business in Oregon. He had not told me it was his company until our second call. He had made me promise not to tell anyone in the family. He said he needed someone who would tell him the truth without worrying about hurting his feelings, and that there was only one person in his life he trusted to do that. I had flown to Millhaven 3 times in those 18 months, staying in that same courtyard off the highway. I had reviewed financial records, interviewed staff, analyzed operations. I had given him a complete picture of where the company was strong and where it was at risk. I had told him things that were hard to hear. He had listened. He had also, apparently, built the entire succession structure of his estate around what I had told him. Mara Westbrook walked the room through the report without embellishment. She explained the methodology, the findings, the recommendations. She explained the professional background she had reviewed before bringing me on to the engagement, my MBA from the University of Washington, my 6 years as a senior operations analyst at a regional infrastructure firm. The 2 previous engagements I had completed for family-owned businesses in the Pacific Northwest. Craig interrupted twice. Westbrook addressed both interruptions with the measured patience of someone who had sat across from difficult people in conference rooms many times before. My uncle said that credentials did not determine who deserved to inherit a family business. Westbrook said he was correct. She also noted that they did tend to clarify the factual accuracy of characterizations made about a person's involvement and contribution. My mother said she had not known any of this, that no one had told her. I looked at her from the end of the table. I said that grandfather had asked me to keep the engagement confidential, and that I had respected his request. She said that was not what she meant. She said she had not known what I was doing with my life, that I had never told them. I held that for a moment. Then I said, as carefully as I could, that I had tried early on, that the conversations had always moved toward what I had left rather than what I was building, that eventually I had stopped trying to explain myself to people who had already decided what I was. No one said anything. Farrell closed the meeting 20 minutes later. The stake passed to me as specified in the trust. Westbrook packed her portfolio. The relatives filed out at different speeds, which tells you a lot about how they were feeling. Craig left quickly and without making eye contact with anyone. The great aunt patted my shoulder on her way out. Ash caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small nod. My mother stayed. When everyone else had gone, she was still sitting in her chair with her hands flat on the table, looking at the copy of the assessment in front of her. I gathered my folder and stood, and for a moment we were the only two people in the room, the way we had been in so many rooms before this one, except that the thing we had always been arguing about was no longer invisible. She said she had assumed I was running from something. She said she had spent 4 years being angry at the version of me she had invented, and that it was strange to sit in a room and see a different version documented in 42 pages. I told her I had not been running. I told her I had been building. She was quiet for a while. Then she said that the thing she had said about me being someone who thought she was too good for Millhaven, the way Craig had put it, she said that had not been fair. I told her I knew. She asked if there was a version of things in which we could talk. Not about the business, just talk. I told her I thought there probably was, but that it would take some practice and that she would need to let me be a person she did not already fully understand. She looked at me for a long moment. She said she could try that. I drove back to Portland the next day. The Hargrove files were in my bag. There were 18 months of work ahead of me, and none of it was going to be easy, and I knew that the business conversations and the family conversations were going to tangle together in ways I could not entirely predict. My grandfather had handed me something that was not just an asset, but a responsibility, and the weight of that felt like exactly the kind of thing he had always believed I could carry. He used to say that the most dangerous thing in any organization was not a person who made mistakes. It was a person who had stopped asking questions because they assumed they already knew all the answers. I don't know what the next year with my mother will look like. I know that the last conversation we had, the one in that emptied conference room in Millhaven, was the first one in years where she did not talk to the version of me she had decided I was. She talked to me. That is not nothing. In fact, for the first time in a long time, it felt like a place to start. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over you after a long conflict finally surfaces into the open. It does not feel like peace exactly. It feels like pressure releasing, slowly, the way a sealed room feels when someone finally opens a window. You notice the air. You notice how much you were holding without realizing it. My grandfather knew something about me that the people closest to me had missed. Not because they were bad people, because they had stopped asking. They had decided and then they had stopped looking. If you have a person in your life, a daughter, a son, a sibling you have not spoken to in years, I want to ask you something. Not about who they were when they left, about who they are now. When is the last time you asked them that question? When is the last time you actually waited for the answer? I have thought a lot about what my grandfather understood that my mother did not because she is a cruel person. She is not. But there is a kind of love that hardens over time into certainty. And once it hardens, it stops being curious. It stops asking. It just knows. And the version of me she knew had not been accurate for a long time before that Wednesday morning in March. What Russell did, hiring me through a third party, keeping the engagement confidential, building his succession plan around 18 months of honest work, was not a gift. It was a conclusion. He had watched me for 30 years and reached a conclusion about what I was capable of, and then he had acted on it. That is not luck. That is someone paying attention when everyone else had already decided. I spent 4 years in Portland building something that no one in Millhaven could see, not because I was hiding, because I had learned, the hard way, that explaining yourself to people who have already made up their minds costs more than it returns. I tried. Early on, the phone calls always turned into the same argument, the same list of grievances, the same question underneath everything. Why did you leave us? And I could never answer that question in a way that satisfied them, because the real answer was not about them at all. It was about me. about needing room to become something that Millhaven, as I had known it, did not have space for. That is not a betrayal. That is just what growing up sometimes looks like from the outside. Craig called me a failure in front of 11 people and thought he was stating a fact. He was actually describing his own limitations, the limits of what he had been willing to see. That is how it works. When we stop observing someone clearly, we fill the gap with whatever narrative is most convenient. Craig's convenient narrative was that I had run away. My mother's was that I had always thought I was better than this family. Neither of them had asked me a single real question in 4 years, so they had no information. They had only the story they had built in my absence. The thing about showing up with documented proof rather than a raised voice is that it cannot be argued with the way an emotion can. Craig could dismiss my feelings. He could not dismiss 42 pages of methodology and findings with my name on the cover. That is not cruelty. That is just the value of doing the work quietly and keeping records. My grandfather used to say that integrity is not what you do when people are watching. It is what you do when you are certain no one will ever find out. I had worked that engagement as carefully as I would have worked any other, not because I thought it would end up in a conference room, because that is the only way I know how to work. What changed between me and my mother after that meeting was not forgiveness exactly. It was information. She finally had accurate information about who I was, and that changed what was possible between us. That is the thing people miss about estrangement. It is not always anger. Sometimes it is just a gap where knowledge should be. And sometimes the only way to close that gap is to let the record speak for itself. I drove back to Portland with Russell's files in my bag and the window cracked and the radio off, and I thought about what he had written in that handwritten note. She always asked the right questions. I had not known he noticed. I am glad he did. I am glad that somewhere in the architecture of his life, he built a door that only opened from my side.